Do you want me to go ahead and begin, Alistair? Oh, okay, great. Well, welcome everybody, both Kathy and Chris at the moment, but hopefully others will join us. But this is the first of our EU Studies Program Faculty Development Seminars for the fall of 2022. This is the second year that we've done this, and this year we have 3 seminars. Today's on European and Transatlantic security. Then next Tuesday, threats to democracy and the rule of law in the European Union, Dr. Uli Sedelmeier from London School of Economics. And then November the 3rd, that's a Wednesday, Germany's role in Europe after the elections, Dr. Claire Greenstein from University of Alabama, Birmingham. So I want to thank Alistair Young and the Center for European and Transatlantic Studies at Georgia Tech, at the Sam Nunn School at Georgia Tech, and they basically have organized these seminars, arranged the speakers, done most of the groundwork on these, and we're very appreciative. This program is funded, by the way, from a grant or by a grant from the European Commission, and we also want to express gratitude to the European Commission. So I will go ahead and introduce our speaker for today, a very distinguished person who we're very pleased to have, General Phil Breedlove. He's a highly decorated retired general of the United States Air Force, where he reached the highest levels of military leadership as the Supreme Allied Commander Europe and the Commander of U.S. European Command between 2013 and 2016. In those capacities, he commanded all U.S. and Allied troops in Afghanistan, Kosovo, as well as all NATO operations across Europe and the Mediterranean. He's a distinguished professor of the practice in the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs at Georgia Tech, and he works with faculty, staff, and students on security issues and policy. He's also a graduate of Georgia Tech in civil engineering. So, General Breedlove, thank you very much for joining us today, and we look very much forward to hearing what you have to say about this important issue of European and transatlantic security.
Great. Thank you for having me. And I see that someone had to download software, so we may have some folks out there doing it. Here is the plan for me. I'm going to rip through some slides. The real thing I want to do is get to a conversation at the end and answer questions, debate some of the remarks I made, etc. I apologize for my video. This is the first time I've done a Zoom from this particular office, and I've got to figure out how to get a little better lighting in here, but we'll make it work. So once again, my view into Europe is based on having served there 8 times, once in Spain, once in Italy, 5 times in Germany, and once in Belgium. Having 2 daughters born there, a son born in Korea, but 2 daughters born in Europe. And so Europe has been the larger part of my career. The slides I'm going to present today are very much with a view of the former commander of NATO, but I'm willing to and able to certain degrees to talk about the more political pieces that are going on, as well as the EU views and other things that are out there. So at any point in today's briefing, if you want to talk about the slide I'm on right now, interrupt me. It won't hurt me. I'll be able to pick back up and move on. Otherwise, what I want to do is spend about 1/3 of our time with this briefing and then about 2/3 of our time in conversation. Next slide, please. So one of the questions that is often asked of me as I have testified in Congress and other things since retirement is why even NATO? And I think that in my mind, my first answer on why NATO is I believe NATO will be more important in the next 70 years than it has been in the last 70 years. And why is that? Because the nature of warfare has changed so much that we don't really understand it the way that we used to when there was an iron curtain and the bad guys were on one side and the purported good guys were on the other, and we knew what we were all about. In fact, in the conferences that I just attended in the last week in Romania and Poland, what was well agreed across the NATO nations is that Russia is at war. Whether we choose to acknowledge we're at war or not, Russia is at war. Clausewitz once said in a very different way that the enemy gets a vote. And so our purported enemy has made their vote. So why NATO? I think that when America withdraws from leadership or participation in the world and retrenches to our shores, we are more apt to get in a war than if we remain engaged overseas. And so with that in mind, and looking at what the last two quote-unquote world wars cost us in blood and treasure, we have to ask ourselves, what is avoiding the next war worth? The very small price we pay to remain in NATO and in that body of influence and decision-making, as opposed to just one day in a war, is a pretty easy choice to make in my mind. And avoiding the conflagration to not only soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, but to our national treasury and the world economy, this is important. And NATO has been not perfect, but in my opinion, extremely successful in keeping the relative major peace on the Eurasia landmass for the last 70 years. But there are those who would argue we don't need NATO because basically conflict is over. We're never going to see another world war. Isn't that kind of what we said between the last two? And so history is not over. We saw Russia in 2008 use its military to change internationally recognized borders and still occupies two portions of the country of Georgia. In 2013, 2014, we saw Russia invade Ukraine, occupy the Ukrainian peninsula of Crimea, and occupy the Ukrainian landmass of the Donbass and install their proxy forces there. We saw the fight in NagornoKarabakh just in the last several months. And now we have, quote unquote, Russian peacekeepers in Nagorno-Karabakh, much the way that the peacekeepers went into Moldova in Transnistria. And then finally, we see Russian issues in Syria, Libya, London, American elections all over the place. And that's why these various fora that I was in the last several weeks all concluded the same thing, and that is that above the line, meaning kinetic actions, Russia is very much engaged in places like Georgia, Ukraine. But below the line, in those below kinetic actions, Russia is engaged in every one of our countries. They certainly are in my country. The last thing that I put up here, it's an interesting conversation, is when people talk about NATO, the first thing they do is talk about Article 5. That's the famous, if one of us is attacked, we're all attacked, and collective defense is the result. I think it's important to remind all that Article 3 preceded Article 5, and Article 3 in shorthand says that every nation is responsible for building its capability to defend itself and build defense such that they can contribute to the defense of other allied members, implying a relationship between each of the members bilaterally, which is also supported in the rest of the Articles of the Atlantic Treaty. And this is something I think we'll talk about more later. Next, please. Okay, so this is a list of things I'm going to touch briefly because most of you are very familiar with these, and these are consistent things we have to worry about. First of all, Russia is continuing pressure in the northern area of the three Baltic nations you see there, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, just below Finland. And this has always been a flashpoint. In fact, some very good studies from Rand and a good friend of mine, Dave Akmanik, likes to talk about how these nations are undefendable. I don't agree with Dave, but he's still brilliant, and I understand his work. The bottom line is Russia has, we can't blow up on this map, but if you look just to the right of Lithuania, there's a little town labeled just right of, I said Lithuania, I meant Latvia, just to the right of the A. That little town is called Pskov right there. And Russia has, in the past half decade, located their most mobile, most capable military force at that town. Now, what do you think is the message that they're sending to the three Baltic nations? It's an aeromobile force, and by helicopter, it's less than 40 minutes to all three of the capitals of the Baltic nations. And so Russia is transmitting constant pressure on the Baltic nations and others. All our nations, as we discussed, Russia is doing what is some call the gray zone or hybrid war. I call it war below the lines of kinetic response. In our information spaces, in our economic spaces, in our diplomatic spaces, in the minds of our people and our youth, that war is going on. And then finally, south, of course, of Ukraine and north of Turkey lies the Black Sea and the occupied peninsula of Crimea and the occupied portion of Ukraine, and the growth of Russian military capability now in and around Crimea and the port of Sevastopol there in Crimea. These are ongoing problems. Nuclear arms control has been much in the topic of discussion lately. The INF, Russia abrogated the INF, in my mind, between 8 and 10 years ago. Some people argue between 13 and 15 years ago, Russia abrogated that treaty. And then basically we, the United States, were the only people in the treaty. And then we backed out of the treaty in the last administration. So right now, ostensibly, we have no effective controls or even attempt to control the purchase and employment of these highly volatile arms, short-range nuclear-capable arms in Europe, and that's a problem. We need to get back to an INF-like capability, and that's really important in my mind. And of course, START, it looks like we now have impetus to remain in New START, and that again is important in my mind, and I'm glad that our administrations have chosen to do that. Ukraine continues as a problem. When Ukraine first happened, I was the combatant commander and the NATO commander, and the decision of Western nations, primarily the decision of the United States, was this is largely a European problem, and we kind of diplomatically wiped our hands of it and said, Mr. Hollande, Ms. Merkel, over to you, using the Minsk protocols and the Normandy format. Wonderful people. I knew Ms. Merkel personally, and wonderful people, but in my opinion, neither the Minsk protocols nor the Normandy format have served Ukraine well. In fact, the new frozen conflict in the Donbass is a result of what I would call the failure of the Normandy formats or Minsk formats and Normandy. Excuse me, had it backwards. We see what some describe as nuclear blackmail. In fact, in the conversations in the last several weeks in Europe, there's a lot of talk of sort of Mr. Putin's red lines that he's drawn in the sand. Start a color revolution, we use nukes. Decapitate us with your prompt global strike, we'll use nukes. If you foment unrest, if you develop or try to raise the people of Russia up against its government, we'll use nukes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the fact of the matter is it works. We are very much deterred, I think, from taking these actions that might provoke Russia, which is the word you hear so much in Washington, D.C. A2AD, that's an entirely military term. What this really talks about is the combination of air defense, sea defense, and land defense, which Russia has employed in various places along their borders with their neighbors, and what that causes to people. In a consistent challenge in NATO and EU, and take me on this if you will, but consistently now across 3 administrations, we see U.S. retrenchment in leadership in Europe. President Obama, who hired me, his statement was, we are closing down wars, not starting wars. And I don't accuse him, but many accuse him of drawing red lines and backing away from them. Mr. Trump was very vocal about, America first and sort of pulling back our lines to our shores. And then President Biden's administration, as you know, has really confused Europe with the decisions that they made on Afghanistan, the decisions they made on AUKUS. And so the Europeans were very vocal in the last 2 weeks at these large multinational gatherings about whither goeth the United States? What is it that we're really about? I mentioned Afghanistan already. Okay, next slide, please. I want to run through just a few slides of things that people don't talk about. Military people and people who are concerned about climate change talk a lot about the Arctic. Whether you believe in climate change or not, it doesn't matter. The ice is receding, and the pole is now opening up new transit routes through the north. These should, I think, be seen as an opportunity. When I talked to a Navy person, they said for a standard cargo ship, depending on the size, type of the cargo ship, it's about 14 days faster to take goods from European ports to Asian ports by going north than by going through the Med. If you're an economic person, if you think about business, 14 days shorter means more transit of those ships, means less cost, more opportunity. It should be a very positive thing that we see happening in the north. Instead, what we see is Russia building and upgrading their military ports, their military airfields, and all of their sensing nations, better preparing themselves to, in their words, quote unquote, control the Northern Passage. And that has been a point of actually friction between Russia and China, who drove an icebreaker and a container ship through what they said was international waters, and Russia said those are our waters. And so there is already contention among relatively major powers in this world about what's going to happen in the north. China desperately wants to be an Arctic nation. They have declared that they are a near Arctic nation, and they will continue to challenge Russia on that northern passage. Next, please. Belarus. This isn't really a new issue, But I think that the conversations, the interactions between Russia and Belarus are increasing in severity and increasing in their dynamic nature. I don't think anybody that's on this video looks at Lukashenko as a good leader. Very few actually see him as a legitimate leader. And the people are making their voice known more about him. The real question is, if not Lukashenko, then who? If not Lukashenko, then what is next? One thing that Lukashenko does is he plays both sides of the street relatively well. He keeps Russia at bay to certain degrees, and he flirts with the West to certain degrees to keep everybody a little bit unsure on his footing. To a military person, he has pushed long and hard to keep Russian military structure out of Belarus. Extremely worrying to me is in the last month, he has agreed to have some Russian forces come and develop a training center and a training area where Russian forces might visit. And that is a door I would rather not have seen open. We see Lukashenko as a really bad person, but we see him as at least someone who is standing up to Russia at this time in history. Next, please. NagornoKarabakh, for all of us on this video, we all know where this is and who this is. The first problem when I talk to people about NagornoKarabakh is Joe and Sally Six-Pack from Kansas could not put their fingers on it on a map. They don't know where it is. They don't know what it means to them, why it would be important, who cares about the Caspian Sea, etc., etc. I worry about Nagorno-Karabakh because in this most recent set of battles and military conflict there, we saw 4 or 5 of the world's largest and most concerning military capabilities involved in that fight. Clearly, we had Russia involved in that fight. They like to play both sides of the street. They sell goods and capabilities to both sides of the street, and they make a lot of money doing it. But Russia seems more to be the patron of Armenia, and they stood to lose a lot if Armenia were overrun. And Armenia was largely defeated and handily defeated in the conflict part of this issue. And it did not reflect well on all of the Russian training, Russian organization, and Russian equipment that Armenia was using. Azerbaijan, on the other hand, had an interesting, I would call it dog's breakfast of people helping them. Turkey, as you saw mostly in the papers, helping train all the way down to the non-commissioner officer level in the Azerbaijan forces. Turkey selling high-end drones and capability to employ precise weapons to Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan, whose economy is not massive or going crazy, but in comparison to Armenia, their economy was doing extremely well. And so Azerbaijan has been upgrading its capabilities in the country. 2 of the surprising correspondents in this are Israel and Iran, who both were selling capability to Azerbaijan. And so Azerbaijan brought some very capable military equipment, training, etc., to the battlefield and just really tore up the sort of old Warsaw Pact organized and equipped army of Armenia. Once again, if we look to the West for any sort of leadership to try to bring this to a quicker halt, we see a failure of multiple peace overtures, a failure of the OSCE and Minsk processes, and largely the peace that has been imposed is because the big benefactors like Russia have been involved and sort of put this thing back in a box.
Saying goodbye. Yesterday's talk was all deja vu for me.
Good.
I'll explain sometime, but it was enjoyable as a kind of a nostalgic look back.
Thanks.
Take care.
One of our most storied professors here at Georgia Tech stopping by to say goodbye on the way out. And so one of the concerns I have on this Nagorno-Karabakh thing is yet again Western leadership not integral or at least playing a large part in how we bring these kind of conflicts to an end. And so something we might talk about in the Q&A here. Okay, next, please. Other new challenges include Turkey. Let me tell you that I remain a glass more than half full on Turkey. I've served in Turkey many times. I've deployed there many times and have commanded their troops and U.S. troops in Turkey for large parts of my latter life. Having said all that, we have Mr. Erdogan, who is very determined to change Turkey. When I first went to Turkey, you couldn't go in a room in any building anywhere without seeing a picture or a bust of Ataturk, Kemal Ataturk, who led the nation to a more Western and more Western governed kind of nation. Of course, Mr. Erdogan is more associated with some of his fellow brothers and sisters from the Middle East and is trying to drive Turkey back towards their roots and back towards their societal norms from which Mr. Ataturk moved the nation. So I really don't like this word secular, but that's the word that so many people use about it. Ataturk put his army in charge of keeping Turkey a secular state. I say that because lots of people ask me how this failed cabal came about, but remembering that the man who was known as the founder of modern Turkey put the army in charge of guaranteeing a secular state might help you understand how we might have an attempt to overthrow Mr. Erdogan, who is moving the country away from a secular state towards this political Islam that Mr. Erdogan seems to want to imply. You know how when an American realtor tries to sell you something, they love this statement: location, location, location. Turkey. Location, location, location. Integral to almost anything we do in the Middle East, anything we do in Eastern Asia, integral to any sort of defense of the southern flank or the eastern flank of NATO, etc., etc., etc. This nation is geopolitically and geostrategically important to us. And we need, in my opinion, offering my opinion now, we need to remain engaged in a way that can take Turkey or bring Turkey back to the place that they've occupied for decades in NATO as far as a great partner in the South and an anchor, a northern anchor to Islam in the Eastern Med. They do have the second largest army in NATO, etc. The friction points, you've heard about them all. The Kurds in the S-400 are the most prominent. The support to Azerbaijan has been a friction point for some. And this, of course, just exacerbates the already tough questions and the already tough conversations that we have had with Turkey. Next slide, please. Here is my abuse of authority and opportunity. I like to talk about the challenges that I had as a senior political leader in the world of dealing with nations, especially nations like Russia, and then dealing with non-nation states like most people call them ISIL, ISIS. I use the word Daesh, which is the word used in the Middle East, but how do we deal with nations out there? And there are some incredible models and acronyms for national power in the military academies and in the military postgraduate schools. We talk about PMISI, PMISI 2I, and Dimefil, and all these other things that are more precise and etc. I use this word because I'm a fighter pilot. We keep things very simple, and people remember it when we keep it simple. So I like to talk about a nation's power in terms of its diplomatic power, its informational power, including intelligence, its military power, and its economic power. And my observation, which I hope maybe we can talk about in Q&A if you challenge me, my observation is that we as a nation are not very good at employing national power. Alistair, flip forward one more. I can't remember if I have my other dime slide here. Yes, okay, so let's stay here. So when Russia attacked into Ukraine, they came with a broad, balanced, all-of-government attack. Diplomatically, they attempted to discredit the Poroshenko government, the formation of Poroshenko. Everything about Ukraine was deemed illegitimate. In fact, if you listen to a Russian talk about Ukraine and you listen to a Ukrainian talk about Ukraine, they don't even use it in the same way in a sentence. Russia talks about the Ukraine because they want you to look at Ukraine as a province or an area of Russia. Ukraine talks about Ukraine, not the Ukraine, because to them, Ukraine is an independent nation of Ukrainians. Even there's people pronounce the capital different. In Kyiv, the local Ukrainians pronounce it Kyiv. If you go in and you say Kiev, they assume that you are Russian balanced because that's the way the Russians say it. And so there's this broad diplomatic attack on the legitimacy of a nation called Ukraine. Secondarily, in the information sphere, they largely went in and talked about the Maidan, the revolution that threw out the Russian puppets and reasserted sort of Ukrainian control of Ukraine, the Maidan, which, oh, by the way, the Ukrainians call that the revolution of dignity. The Russians broadly attacked that, saying this is all a CIA operation. This is all straight out of America. This is all something that the Americans and select other Western nations have imposed on the Ukrainians as an attack on Russia. So a broad information campaign. Militarily, Russia used its ground forces to change internationally recognized borders twice, when they invaded Crimea and then when they invaded the Donbass region, the southeast region around the towns of Lugansk and Donetsk in Ukraine. Economically, what did they do? The winters of 13 and 14 were two of the coldest in the last 100 years in Ukraine. And economically, Russia recalled energy loans, raised energy prices, and even in some cases shut off energy flow to Ukraine in these cold winters. People lost their lives because of this economic blackmail of Russia on Ukraine. So I just used Russia as an example. We could talk about this in the context of other nations or other targets for Russia, but the point is they use a broad diplomatic, informational, military, economic, all of government attack on Ukraine. How did the West respond? I'm not going to grade the papers of other nations. It's inappropriate, but I will grade the papers of my nation. And diplomatically, I give us a tiny little D, because what did we do? We wiped our hands and said, Mr. Hollande, Ms. Merkel, over to you. Minsk, Normandy, make it happen. And how has that worked out for us or for Ukraine? Informationally, we don't really do disinformation on the level of Russia, so the little tiny I there. Militarily, what did the U.S. do for Ukraine after they had been attacked twice? We sent them meals ready to eat, which you may know in World War II as sea rats. They're better than sea rats, but they're still just meals in a bag. And jokingly, I say almost 2 weeks later, we sent them medical aid, because if you eat meals ready to eat consistently, you're going to need medical aid. And then it was months before we considered sending purely defensive counter-battery radars to, just so they could understand where the Russians were firing from and try to help those who were under attack. And then it was over a year before we started considering giving Ukraine any kind of defensive lethal capability, first in the form of javelins. So militarily, I give us a little tiny M in response. What did we do to Russia? What do we always do to Russia? We don't provoke them diplomatically, informationally, or militarily. What we always do to Russia is sanctions. More sanctions, additional sanctions, wider sanctions, deeper sanctions, special, really special sanctions, and more sanctions. So this is what we do. So just to recap, Russia attacks us broadly and deeply in all elements of national power. When we respond to Russia, it's sanctions. Oh, by the way, let's consider Daesh or ISIL. Diplomatically, do we have a plan to bring intense pressure on these elements around the world? Not really. Informationally, much like Russia, we don't do disinformation on a strategic scale like Daesh was doing. Literally American young ladies going to fight alongside the fighters in Syria, as well as men. But their information campaign was incredible. Economically, did we do anything to try to get at the root cause problems of Daesh? Do we have a Marshall Plan for trying to get at the root causes of Islamic extremism? No. What do we always do to Islamic radicals? We bomb them. So once again, we use a different tool, but we do it in, again, a very unbalanced way. we are economically sanctions driven with Russia, and we are militarily driven with radical Islam. The purpose of these last two slides is for me to, as I said, I'm abusing my time and power to suggest to you that one of the things we need to consider as we approach these things in Europe and the surrounding areas is we need to be more balanced. We need to consider an all-of-government reply to an all-of-government attack. And I think a good place to start talking about that are in our academic institutions. Next slide, please. So, this is my get off the stage slide, although I'm going to abuse my power for just one more after this. The world needs our students. Our students are going to solve the problems that we have left them. And I would give our generation about a C-. We're leaving a lot of problems behind. The security landscape is ever more difficult. COIN, that word means counterinsurgency. We've been doing counterinsurgency in Afghanistan for almost 20 years. We've lost our skill at doing large force employment, like Russia has done in Ukraine. We are in a hybrid war. We are watching Russia fight proxy wars. These are all complicators on our security environment. I believe, contrary to some senior leadership in some of the recent administrations, that we need allies and we need alliances. Isolationism and retrenchment to our shores, in my opinion, gets us into wars, vice avoiding them. And the last 2 pages of discussion, I believe we need to think more in an all-of-nation answer to problems presented to us in an all-of-nation format. And I believe that the West has to respond, and I believe that the United States has to be at the leadership table. And finally, a shameless pitch for next slide, Alistair. One of the things that we're talking about here at Georgia Tech, other schools like Stanford, University of New Mexico, Drexel, and some schools have smaller programs, are beginning to embrace this concept of peace engineering. And this is what I think, and please don't be offended by the word, some people are, this is a marriage of hard sciences and soft sciences. This is an acknowledgement that an engineering process can't solve these kind of problems, but if you marry an engineering process to a strong cultural, liberal arts based set of tools and capabilities, if you marry the two together, we have the ability to get after this problem. This very simple chart talks about structural violence at the bottom, which I'll discuss in a minute, but it talks about a conflict or a problem rising, and in the beginning we want to avoid it. If we can't avoid it, we want to dampen it before it gets to violence, and if we can't dampen it, then we need to restore after the violence. And what we do is apply this combination of engineering problem solving coupled with the skills and capability of social sciences and cultural norms, and put the two together to try to form this team to take this peace engineering approach. Under the chart is this interesting bar addressing structural violence. We're not talking about just wars here. One of the first things that our consortium is thinking about looking at in detail is gun violence here in the United States. This applies to any sort of a problem, not just wars. And we want to apply this framework of thought to these problems. And that's what the gray box is about. The gray box is about all of those structural problems that lead to violence, income inequality, racism. You just list them. There's a whole stack of things that lead to violence. And this is where we would try to address those root causes of Islamic militants in order to avoid creating more of them, et cetera, et cetera. So a teaser. If you're interested in talking about peace engineering ever, would love to get a few people on our consortium from Drexel or Stanford to give you a video discussion on that. Next slide. Okay, I've taken my eyes off how many are here, but among the 7 of us, I am ready for you to throw rocks, throw what we used to call in the Air Force the BS flag, or let's have some questions and conversation. Over to you all as moderators.
Okay, I believe there's just a few of us here, so we probably can just have a an open discussion. I think if you have a question, maybe feel free just to express it. I don't think we're going to be talking over each other too much since there's only a few of us. But I'll begin if nobody else minds. Phil, I wanted to link together a couple of slides or a couple of things you said. At the end of your presentation, you talked about this asymmetrical conflict really that's going on involving Russia and the West, and how Russia is using an all-of-government approach in this conflict, whereas the West is in this response is very restricted to primarily economic instruments. And what we need is a all-of-nation, all-of-government response. But then this links back to what you said earlier about Putin's threat to use nukes in the event of a provocation, however he would define that. So I guess my question is, how serious is he about that threat? Would an all-of-government approach to responding to Russia provoke that type of a response if he's serious about it? And what exactly does he mean by nukes? Is he talking about intercontinental ballistic missiles? Is he talking about battlefield tactical short-range missiles? What exactly does he have in mind there?
So it's an excellent question, and really it's the $64,000 question when it comes to the National Security Council and sort of our national policy way ahead. So Russia, the things they fear the most, decapitatory strikes, color revolutions, a fully generated NATO to fight, et cetera, et cetera. These are the things that they have a deterrence scheme as well. We don't know whether they would really use nukes, but the fact that they talk about it has deterred us. We are self-deterred. When I was commanding and we were addressing this Ukraine issue, I mean, the first words out of the mouth as my plan hit the National Security Council was, we cannot provoke Russia. I turned around and asked the question about, when are we going to be provoked? They invaded and occupied Georgia. They invaded and occupied Ukraine twice. They have come in the guise of peacekeeping and stayed in Moldova. They're now coming in the guise of peacekeeping, and I doubt will ever leave Nagorno-Karabakh. And so, we're worried about not provoking them. When are we going to be provoked? So that is a rhetorical question, of course, to start the conversation. In my mind, and Alistair may want to jump in here as the professor and correct the student, but in my mind, we have taken tools off the table, and we have even the EU and NATO, but we can't really get a strong deterrent voice diplomatically out of either. So what did we do in NATO for the first several days after the invasion of Ukraine? I do this for effect. We had a strong statement about how bad that was. A strong statement. End. Nothing further. And so we pass up tools that we can use. It's hard in these consensus organizations to get some of the things out of them that we need to. But what we see in many NATO situations is you first act in a coalition of the willing that is somewhat less than, in my case, 28 nations or now 30 nations. But do we just abandon? And frankly, I think that we, the United States, we, several other elements of the West, need to be at the table in these Minsk processes and this Normandy format. By not being there, we send a diplomatic message, literally, I think, of encouragement. Hey, you guys, not paying attention to this too much. Take care of it. And so, back to the Putin factor. Until he sees an increased cost, and I'm not talking about money nor necessarily war, but until he sees an increased cost that he doesn't believe he can survive, why would he change his stance on the tools that he's using? And I believe it's a conversation that maybe we should have. Do we believe that any of the sanctions that we have imposed so far have truly changed at the strategic level any of Mr. Putin's calculus? I don't know if I answered your question, but I'll stop there and we can keep after it.
Oh, thank you. Anybody else have a question? Well, let me just follow up then with what you said. I just really have a difficult time with all of the focus on China now as the main strategic threat to the United States. I just have a difficult time imagining the United States mustering the willpower to mount an all-of-nation response to Russian aggression in Eastern Europe. I mean, quite honestly, it doesn't seem, this part of the world doesn't seem to mean as much to the United States as it once did. And I have my doubts about the willpower there. But I do believe that it does mean more, or it should mean more, to the Europeans themselves. This is their backyard. This is their neighborhood. This is more of an existential threat to Europe than to the United States. So if there's going to be an all-of-nation response, I think it's going to have to primarily come from the Europeans, with the United States supporting that, of course. And I just wonder what you see as the future there as far as Europe's contribution to European security. Are the Europeans, in what ways can they be pushed maybe to do more and to take more seriously this threat from Russia? Understanding that the United States really has plenty of other fish to fry and maybe can't be as singly focused on European security as we have been in the past.
So first, let me get back to the initial premise. I would be extremely happy if in a team effort, we in the West or NATO or EU and NATO, if any combination of the above, were to take a more all-of-government approach to reply. The Europeans have sort of adopted the same thing, which is sanctions, or etc. They have taken a few other minor things, but not in a large and demonstrative way. So my first thought in reply is I would love to see it that we collectively would come up with a more balanced reply. I haven't really seen the impetus for that. I saw at the Warsaw Summit and at the Wales Summit, the first summit, NATO summit after the invasion of Ukraine, I saw the nations try to do that. and they rejected sort of military replies. They rejected, based on Western values, any sort of answering information campaign, and they rejected any military action that they feared would provoke. And so I think that I would be happy to see a more balanced reply. Let me tell you that the last thing any senior military commander wants is to fight. We don't want to go to war. I understand that. But if we continue to self-deter to the degree that all we do is sanctions on the one hand or military with Daesh, I don't see a positive future for us in affecting change. Deterrence to a military man or woman is in the mind of the deterred. It's not about measuring things and this and that, how much do we have on this, how much we spend on that. It's how our collective actions and credibility and capability affect the mind of those that we want to deter. And we haven't found the formula by which we change Mr. Putin's calculus about how all of this is affecting us. Just a short comment on China. China is going to be the long-term problem. In the short term, we have a nation with, some believe, as many as 20,000 nuclear warheads in storage or employed. And that's a problem. We've got to deal with Russia in the near term. What scares me worse than anything, I've been asked more than once, why are you worried about Russia? They're imploding. Their demographics are upside down, and they are. Their economy is smaller than Italy's and declining. Yes, it is. They are unable to continue the level of effort they're making into the future. Scares me worse than anything is a failed Russia with 20,000 nuclear warheads soon to be loose. That scares me worse. We need to find a way ahead in cooperation. You choose the word. People hate any word you choose here. People hate it somewhere in America. Cooperation, collaboration, whatever it is, we need to find a way ahead with Russia that doesn't involve them collapsing and then the world having to deal with their nuclear arsenal out there. So I think I'll stop there.
Michael, can you hear me?
Yes, Olavik.
Yes, I'm on the phone. Okay, and let me ask a question on Belarus and Lukashenko. The approach adopted by Europe and the United States is, as you have stated a number of times, sanctions. But those sanctions seem to push Lukashenko more and more into the arms of Putin. The Belarusian economy now is being basically, subsidized, has to be subsidized by Russia. So the playing room of Lukashenko, what he had, let's say 4 or 5 years ago, to try to play the West at times against Putin, to hold on to a modicum of some kind of political autonomy, it seems to me is disappearing. Is there another type of approach that would perhaps be more productive in dealing with Belarus?
Sir, I'm sorry I missed your name, but may I just say that I'm in violent agreement with what you said. I think I made it very clear in my briefing that sanctions is not always the answer, and I agree with the formulation you have made about pushing Belarus towards Russia. And that's what I would first change in dealing with Belarus. You're going to hate me for what I'm about to say, but all too often when we deal with governments like this, we tie even the very first aid or the very first engagements, we tie it to some sort of change in authoritarian rule or change in the way the government is formulated. I would first avoid that. We've held our nose with Lukashenko for a long time. I think, in my opinion, not the military's opinion nor our government's opinion, in my opinion, we need to embrace, to a degree, Belarus in order to open up and relieve them of some of that dependency on Russia. Are there things that we can do in trade that would begin to take away some of the dependencies? Are there things that we could do in energy to begin to take away some of the dependencies? Are there things that we could do in, like we do with Georgia, in military training or other things, to just open up and show that the West is willing to work with Belarus to get through their troubles? I'm in favor of finding those ways, and not in the very short term tying that to any sort of change in the government. Let us work through that. Now, clearly, we could be abused. Clearly, it could not work. But right now, what we're doing, in my opinion, much like yours, is not working. And we need to arrest the slide towards Russia of Belarus. So I'm not sure I answered your question, but I want you to know I agree with your formulation.
On
Thank
the
you.
topic of Belarus, what's preventing Putin? What would be the cost to him of simply taking it over? That several years ago, that was the big, I think, conjecture was that after Ukraine, Belarus was next, and but that hasn't happened. And what are the benefits to Putin of not acting in that way? What would be the costs of? I mean, obviously he could do that if he wanted to. What's holding him back?
So again, we'll offer you my opinion, and my opinion has been formulated by reading other learned people. I do not accredit anything I'm about to say to any of my own thought, but I've adopted things that I agree with. So this is going to sound a little bit like talking out of both sides of the mouth. I have told you that I think that our response to Russia when they invaded Ukraine twice was inadequate to task. And I think that it actually signaled to Russia that the United States, at least, was not going to cause the kind of stink that would rise to any sort of further military reply. So having said that, now I'll say something that sounds completely opposite. There are those, and I agree with them, that will say that they believed, that Russia believed that the West's response was more than they expected. Some write that Mr. Putin believed that when he took over Crimea, nobody would have any problems with it because in his mind, Crimea was Russia's and they were just taking it back. But the hue and cry of nations about that, I think, surprised him. And I agree with that line of logic. And so what's clear, I think, to Mr. Putin is that he can't just walk over an internationally recognized border and expect to get away scot-free. I think that he also, to some degree, believes that the world is, again, sort of holding their nose right now and saying, Crimea, we're never going to acknowledge it, but we don't ever expect it to change. Donbass, we're never going to acknowledge it, but we don't expect it to change. And so the world has moved on a little bit from that. And in his mind, Belarus might change that more accepting dynamic in some way that might cause him problem in Ukraine. Russia now is completely dependent in the southern region on Sevastopol. and the military buildup and capability in Crimea. And I don't think they want to do anything that might stir the beast on anything. So I think that Russia wants to take Belarus from within. They want to turn the leader or get a new leader, or they want to get Belarus even more dependent on their energy, trade, and goods, so that it's a fait accompli sort of approach. And that's why I suggested what I did about how we might approach Belarus, which is to loosen those reins by initiating some of that trade, some of that diplomatic overture, et cetera, with Belarus.
Hey, thank you. We probably have time for one more question if anybody has one.
Michael, let me try. And I don't have really a good feel for this, but looking at Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Nagorno-Karabakh, it was a I don't know. Armenians apparently, tried to freeze the Nagorno-Karabakh issue, but that was totally unacceptable for Azerbaijan because of the refugee problem that it had created. Apparently, about 1 million Azerbaijanis at the intermediate zone, not Nagorno-Karabakh itself, but the other areas, and no one did anything about it, and of course the West did nothing about it to try to somehow solve the issue. What should perhaps, say, the United States be doing in this area of the world to try to coordinate with Turkey perhaps in this area? Is that an option?
So it's a very tough question to answer, and I'll try to dissect it along the following lines. I think at the strategic level, what we want to do is continue to support the advancement of Western values, Western economic norms, Western engagement. And that would be part of what I mentioned before about how we might approach Belarus. But the same thing applies. Trying to continue to champion that, and the word just really doesn't go down well in this part of the world, but to continue to offer and support democratic values. At the operational and tactical level below strategic, I think come some of the things that you talked about. I think the biggest influence in Azerbaijan right now is Turkey. Turkey trained their people. Turkey sold them kit. Turkey helped them think through the problems that they were going to have on the battlefield with Azerbaijan. So I think we need Turkey, but this is another place that while we might not want to do it, we're going to have to deal with Russia. We're going to have to, and they would love this, sit down at the big boy table with them and have those conversations, because my knowledge of Azerbaijan and Armenia is that they were both buying Russian equipment, and Russia was making money in both countries. Azerbaijan then turned to Israel, Iran, and Turkey for a more high-end capability, and so they established some new engagements. But Russia is still the big boy on the block in that neighborhood. And so I think we're going to have to sit down with the big kids in the neighborhood and begin to work a way forward. I must tell you that I think it's too late. I agree with many pundits who write that we don't expect to ever see the Russian peacekeepers come out. They're there now ad infinitum, a la Transnistria. And so we may have missed a window of opportunity, but we still have to give it the old college try, in my opinion.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think we're about out of time, Alistair. But I just want to thank General Breedlove for taking the time to speak to us today. Unfortunately, we didn't have a real good attendance. I wish more people were here to hear what you had to say, because it was an incredibly informative overview of the security situation in Europe, especially as it pertains to the Russian challenge. So thank you once again, and we're very appreciative. And Alistair, thank you as well for putting this together. I don't know if there's anything you wanted to say before we sign off here.
No, just to add to my thanks to Phil, and thank you for organizing your side of it. And we'll be doing this again next week, same time, same place, with Dr. Uli Sedelman. So thank you, Phil, for sharing your comments again. And thank you for being here.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.